As with the Red Scare that followed the First World War, we can look to a number of wartime agencies that contributed to the atmosphere of fear and suspicion leading us into the Second Red Scare. So during World War II, one of the groups that was very active was HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or House Committee on Un-American Activities. It investigated suspected fascists and communists during the war, and then when the war ended, it just transferred its activity over to a quest to root out communists in our midst. One of the key figures on HUAC was Richard Nixon, who first made his national reputation as one of the hardline anti-communists who was questioning the suspected communists with his work on HUAC. HUAC achieved its greatest notoriety in 1947 by launching an investigation of the film industry and Hollywood. The suspicion at that time was that there were many communists or former communists or suspected communists living and working in Hollywood. And in fact, there were some. Initially, the hearings were friendly enough. The very first person to testify in the HUAC hearings was John Wayne. John Wayne, as you know, is no communist. He's a great American patriot of that era. But within a few days, not everyone testifying was John Wayne. There were some communists or former communists beginning to testify, and others eventually who refused to cooperate with the process. As one of these actors argued, "Who's next? Is it your minister who will be told what he can say in the pulpit? Is it your children's school teacher who will be told what he can say in the classroom? Who are they after? They're after more than Hollywood. This reaches into every American city and town." And so eventually there were a group of 10 writers, producers, and directors who came to be called the Hollywood 10, who were jailed for contempt when they refused to testify during this process. They became something of a cause célèbre during this period, and people protested and carried banners, "Free the Hollywood 10." In essence, they were being targeted, and this is supposed to be a country that supports free speech and freedom of religion and all of those sorts of freedoms. Another wartime agency that was very active in the post-war period was the FBI, which was headed up by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover, by this period, was a thoroughly well-established and powerful figure in Washington. He became the head of the FBI in 1924 and remained until 1972. And Hoover took particular pleasure in digging up the dirt against people during this time. He collected vast files on politicians and even average citizens that he could hold against people. And so there were many people in the country operating under an atmosphere of kind of fear and suspicion. So where did this atmosphere of fear and suspicion come from? What is the motivation behind it? Well, there are a number of different reasons we can point to. One of them, as I mentioned, is World War II itself. While conditions were a little bit different from World War I, there's a similar atmosphere of super patriotism, pride in the country, fear of foreigners, especially Germans. And in the aftermath of the war, all of that emotion was readily transferred into a fear and perhaps hatred of communists. Religion was another factor, as the country during this period began celebrating itself as a nation of Christianity and contrasting that with the communists and Soviets who were usually considered atheists. The economy, oddly enough, was a factor. The prosperity of the 1950s played a role because communism finds its greatest followers in times of great need. We think back to the Great Depression, the mid-1930s, and FDR's policies, which were moving very far to the left. When people are impoverished and they have nothing, they're drawn to a philosophy that says, okay, everyone will share equally, even if it's not much. But as prosperity begins to set in and more people have some means and are reaching middle-class status, then the ideology of communism is not so appealing. And so by the early to mid-1950s, it was much easier to marginalize communists as a very small minority group, which by that time they were. Another idea is that red baiting had become a very effective political tactic. Even by 1946, it could be very effective to suggest that your opponent was soft on communism, if not a little bit communist themselves. And we saw in the campaign of Henry Wallace in 1948 that it was very easy to derail a campaign of someone by accusing them of being soft on communism. So I think it might be worth taking just a moment to remind us why at that time it was thought that communists were so bad. In today's setting, I think it's much more common perhaps to accept, anyone can believe what they want to believe, and there's no cost to that. But in this era, remember that the thought was that all communists had their first loyalty to Moscow and to Russia. And so the thought at that time was that you quite literally could not be an American and be communist at the same time. If you were communist, it was a form of treason. Your first loyalty lay somewhere else. And so many Americans were content to say that this was a crime or an action that was worth being deported, and some people would be happy to see communists executed for treason. Now, Truman might have calmed some of this down a little bit as president. He might have pulled back the reins on the FBI and so on. Instead, Truman contributed to it. He kind of fed this hysteria in March of 1947, when he required that all federal employees were to undergo a loyalty inspection and have to take a loyalty oath. And many state and local governments followed suit. Ultimately, more than 2 million people were inspected. About 2,000 people were fired, 10,000 more resigned, and in general there was an atmosphere of unhappiness by many people around having to take these loyalty oaths. Whether you're a good patriotic American citizen or not, having to take this sort of oath just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so you might be wondering if, in fact, these sorts of things are constitutional or not. Don't we live in a country of free speech and the right to protest and so on? Well, in fact, the Supreme Court made a decision in the 1951 Dennis versus U.S. case. And their ruling is a very important one because their decision was that the threat of communism overrode individual rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And so what that meant was that your individual freedoms took a back seat to national security. Perhaps that sounds vaguely familiar to you because it has set a precedent that the federal government has called upon several times, and most notably in passing the Patriot Act after 9/11. The threat of terrorism overrides your individual rights and freedoms. And so from that time to now, we've had a lot of debate and discussion about tapping phones and looking into people's private records, which we would think would be the right to privacy and freedom of speech and so on. But the Dennis decision has overridden that. Also, within this atmosphere, the country undergoes something of a nuclear obsession with preparedness and nuclear shelters. It was very common for people to have bomb shelters in the backyard. School students had to go through nuclear practice where they would get under the desks and this sort of thing. And you see the very famous Bert the Turtle advertisement there on the right, and his little motto was duck and cover. Bert ducks and covers. He's smart, but he has his shelter on his back. You must learn to find shelter. And so school children were taught to duck behind a wall or get under their desks if it was thought that there was a nuclear explosion. The Red Scare reached new heights of paranoia in 1950 when Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin fueled the flames in the midst of a speech when he said, "I have here in my hand a list of the names of 205 men that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department." Now, McCarthy never revealed the names on the list, and several different times in giving similar speeches, the number of names changed in his claim from 205 to 81 to 57 and so on. It seemed he never knew how many names he had. But understand what was so terrifying about this is that communists, remember, this is treason. These are traitors to the country. Communists working for the State Department. This is the group that oversees our foreign affairs. And so it's uncertain whether there was any grounds to McCarthy's claims. And McCarthy was really a reprehensible sort of figure. He was rude and belligerent. He kept a bottle of whiskey in his briefcase and frequently appeared to be drunk while he was speaking. He was kind of disheveled. He made sexist remarks. He belched publicly. And yet, no one simply stood up and told McCarthy to sit down and be quiet. And there were a number of reasons for that, one of which was that everyone was afraid to challenge him. Remember the atmosphere of the time. It would be very easy to fall subject to red baiting. If you challenged him, he could either claim that your name was on the list, or, I think probably more realistic, he could claim that, are you suggesting you don't want me to seek out these communists? Are you soft on communism? Do you have communist sympathies? And it would have ruined anyone's political career. There was also just enough evidence during this period to perhaps support these kind of paranoid claims. This was the age of a series of sensational spy cases. In 1946, a Soviet defector produced evidence of Soviet spies on the atomic energy research program. There were a couple of different cases coming out of that. And then most famously, the Alger Hiss case in 1948. Alger Hiss was as upstanding a citizen as you could ever find. He was incredibly well educated. He was clean cut, he was good looking, and had a list of references, very long, recommending him, including FDR himself. He had worked under FDR. In 1948, Whittaker Chambers, who was a Time magazine editor, was called to testify before HUAC, and he named Alger Hiss as a spy. Now, Whittaker Chambers was just about the opposite of Alger Hiss. He was kind of sloppy looking, he was disheveled, and he was a homosexual, which at that time was one more mark of condemnation against him. And so as the testimony went on, it was Chambers who came to be questioned by the media and who was looking bad throughout this. And eventually, Whittaker Chambers got so frustrated that he led the media to his, he had a farm, he led them out to the field at his farm where he had a hollowed-out pumpkin, and he reached into the pumpkin and pulled out microfilm that proved that Alger Hiss was indeed a spy. And it had something to do with the old typewriters where one key is a little bit off, and they could identify it as Alger-Hiss. You can't make this stuff up. This is such a fantastic tale. Alger-Hiss was ultimately convicted of perjury in 1950 and served 3 years in jail, although he contended to his death that he was innocent. In 1951, the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg made front-page news, and in 1953 they were executed for espionage. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg could have been your neighbors. They were just a regular family next door. And so these kind of cases contributed greatly to people looking around at their friends and neighbors and coworkers and wondering who might be a spy. If Alger-Hiss was a spy, anyone could be a spy. If the Rosenbergs were spies, then any of us could be spies. And so the 1950s literally is a time when we are peering through the windows at our neighbors, wondering if they might be spies. And this also added to Joseph McCarthy's claims. Perhaps these people really are spies. The Korean War contributed to the Red Scare on the home front. And I mentioned that before, that the fact that we are fighting this war against communism abroad seemed to escalate the importance of making sure that there were no communists in our midst. It wasn't until 1954 that Joseph McCarthy was finally silenced. In essence, he overstepped his bounds. He accused members of the U.S. Army of being communists. And when these hearings went off in 1954, they were shown live on television, which was a huge and important point. Prior to that, most Americans had only heard McCarthy on the radio, or perhaps read about him in the papers. They had not seen him at work. And so here is McCarthy, this unpleasant, nasty, belligerent individual, and he's doing his finger pointing and spitting and so on. And the members of the Army are there, completely respectful, clean-cut, as you would expect. And finally, the famous line from one of the attorneys, "Have you no decency, sir?" And of course, McCarthy had no decency, but that was kind of the final straw for McCarthy. And after that, his credibility was shot, and he disappeared fairly quickly from the scene. But for about 4 years, McCarthy went unchecked as one of the most powerful people in the country, and the Red Scare consumed the country from the late 1940s up until the mid-50s. So just to summarize a few of the important points about the Great Fear, or the Red Scare, for one thing, it restricted free speech. Remember the Dennis case. This is something that I hope you'll take with you even after this course is over, just to recall that the Supreme Court and the federal government has set a precedent that any threat to national security overrides our individual rights to free speech and other individual freedoms. Secondly, the Red Scare influenced international affairs, and international affairs influenced the Red Scare on the home front. So remember, it's this kind of fear of spies on the home front. We're worried about that because of how it's going to impact the Korean War, or the nuclear missile program, or these other things going on. And finally, we might say that the Red Scare was one of only a handful of things that dampened an otherwise positive mood in the country in the early and mid-1950s. On the whole, this is seen as an era of great contentment and prosperity, which we will discuss more thoroughly in the next chapter.